All right, everybody, we are back with another deck tech. My name is Sugi. I'm with LorcanaCast, and we are going to talk about New World Mill. The idea behind this deck is to play a whole new world. Check out this beautiful card. The effect says each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. So you want to just eat away at your opponent's deck, eat away at their resources, keep them off kilter, keep them off tempo, and eventually they're going to run out of fuel. So how does this deck work? Well, let's take a look. First of all, we are going to be using this card here, Magic Broom, as the primary means of returning cards to our deck. So the Magic Broom has an effect called Sweep. When you play this character, you may shuffle a card from any discard pile into its player's deck. And then you have the Mickey Mouse Wayward Sorcerer, which allows you to discount the cost of a broom by 1 ink for each sorcerer on the board. And Ceaseless Worker says whenever one of your broom characters is banished in a challenge, you may return that card to your hand. So the idea is you are going to use the Mickey Broom loops to play the broom, challenge it into something. It deals 2 damage. It would get banished, but when Mickey is on the field, it goes back to your hand. You play the broom again. You activate its effect to put cards into your deck. So you can continuously play Whole New World, and you should, in theory, force your opponent to draw more cards than you do, and then they're going to lose to the mill condition where if they cannot draw a card, they lose the game. Now, there are lots of cards in here that help you draw and filter. So we've got, first of all, Simba, the Future King. When you play this character, you may draw a card and then choose and discard a card. So this body is here simply to control what's in your hand. You draw a card and discard the worst thing in your hand. Very simple. Next up is another tool to draw cards, the Beast's Mirror. You exert this card, pay 3. If you have no cards in your hand, draw a card. This is here as an ink target, or if you burn out of cards and you just can't get into what you need, you can use the Beast's Mirror, but it's kind of there as an ink target to just kind of help you play an ink every single turn. Next up, we have the Magic Mirror, another tool to draw cards. You just exert it, pay 4, draw a card. Very simple, very effective. Ursula's Cauldron. So this is a very powerful card to filter. You exert the card. You look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put 1 on the top of your deck, 1 on the bottom. In this deck specifically, there are a couple of combo pieces you really want to see, and Ursula's Cauldron helps you get there very quickly. You don't actually hate seeing 2 of these on the board because you can exert 1, look at 2, put 1 at the bottom, put 1 at the top. Then you can exert the second one, look at a third card essentially. So the one you put on the top, a new card you didn't see, and then do the exact same thing. Put 1 on the bottom, 1 on the top. And then you've got all these other tools to draw cards like Friends on the Other Side or Maleficent Sorceress. When you play her, you can draw a card. We also have the Dr. Facilier Remarkable Gentleman, which states, whenever you play a song, you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put 1 on the top of your deck and the other on the bottom. So we've just got tons and tons of filter. You've got Ursula's Cauldron here, and then you've got Dr. Facilier when you play songs. He's also a 2/4 body. He can sing Friends on the Other Side and then use his own effect. So all of these cards are here to help us get into the Mickey Broom Loops combo. So you can get a couple Mickeys on the board. You can start looping out the brooms. You also, this is actually something I thought of after we posted on Twitter. You can use White Rabbit's Pocket Watch for an interesting loop. So it costs 3 to play. And the effect is exert the Pocket Watch, pay 1. Chosen character gains rush this turn. So an interesting combo you can do is you play a broom, activate the effect to put a card into your deck, then you trigger the Pocket Watch, then you can give the broom rush, you can challenge the broom into something. If the Mickey's on the board, it would be banished but goes back to your hand. Then you can play the broom a second time to then put another card from your discard pile back into your deck. There's another interesting combo. If you have 2 Mickeys on the board, all of your brooms cost 0 to play. So if you have a broom on the board already, you can challenge with it. It gets banished and mounts to your hand. Then you play it for free. You use the effect to put a card into your discard pile. You activate Pocket Watch, challenge, it's banished, goes back to your hand. You play it for free. You activate the effect again, and so on and so forth. If you have multiple Pocket Watches, you can continue doing this loop with one broom. If you have multiple brooms, etc., etc. So this is an interesting way to continuously refill your deck with cards and keep putting in the best options. You also have the Queen here to just exert, draw a card. Very simple, very straightforward. You just want to keep getting cards into your hand, getting all the tools you need, and then just blow your opponent's hand out. And again, rinse, wash, repeat. You want to play a whole new world as many times as possible. After you play it, you can put it back into your deck with brooms. Then you can use the filters to get to it either through Ursula's Cauldron, or if you sing songs with Facilier, you can again look at the top two, put one on the top, put one on the bottom. You've got great draw power here with friends on the other side. You've got Maleficent Sorceress. You've got Tinkerbell, who exert, draw a card, then discard a card. Lots of ways to keep going through your deck very quickly and very efficiently. A couple of tech cards we put in here. We have Donald Duck, the Musketeer, for a couple of reasons. One, he has Bodyguard. So you have 2/5. You can use him to protect some of your things like the Queen, so that they have to go through Donald, and the Queen can very safely exert to draw cards behind him. You can also use Donald to protect Tinkerbell. So there's a couple interesting matchups that you kind of fall behind in, and that's going to be the aggro lists, specifically like the Stitch Rush deck, where they just flood the board with a ton of little bodies. You don't have a lot of challengers. If you look at your characters, you have Simba here, not really great at attacking. Dr. Facilier, not really great at attacking. All of these characters are primarily setup pieces for this whole new world loop. So you don't actually have a very offensive deck, in all honesty. Your offense is using whole new world to disrupt the opponent, and then using the brooms to just consistently crash into your opponent, replay the brooms, put cards back into your deck, crash into your opponent, play the broom again, reset your deck, so on and so forth. But inherently at a 1-to-1 ratio, none of your characters here really fight, except for Tinkerbell. She's your only beater. She's a 4/5. When you play her, everything on the opponent's side takes 1 damage. And during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you may deal 2 damage to an opposing character. So you have a couple tools here against aggro. First off is Grab Your Sword. This is a 5-ink song. Very simple ability. It just says deal 2 damage to each opposing character. So the combo here is you can sing Grab Your Sword with the Queen, which deals 2 damage to everything. So your opponent's board takes a hit. Their smaller things fall off, so their 1 and 2 drops generally don't exist anymore. Then you can play Tinkerbell, and she deals 1 additional damage. So now you've done 3 damage to everything on their board. And if you shift her onto the smaller Tinkerbell, the tiny Tactician, she can then immediately challenge and deal 2 additional damage. So if the combo goes off, you can essentially get 5 damage onto a target, plus Tinkerbell has gotten rid of something because she banished something by challenging, on top of you dealt 3 damage to everything else. So the opponent's board is pretty weak. It's hurting pretty bad at this point. It's not as good as like a Be Prepared where everything just gets banished, but it's pretty darn close. 3 damage eats a lot of things in the game right now, and then Tinkerbell can challenge into something a little bit bigger, and her ability to deal 2 more damage to something else generally allows you to take out a majority of the targets and threats you don't want to deal with, and then Donald Duck is helping protect Tinkerbell. Also, Donald Duck has an ability, say, Stay Alert. During your turn, your Musketeer characters gain evasive. So Donald having 2 strength can punch into a majority of the evasive characters. So if you have Grab Your Swords and Donald, not too much survives that trade. You've got like Tigger, who's a 4/4. So Donald will deal 2. He will not be banished because he's got 5 willpower. You can play Grab Your Swords, which does an additional 2 damage. Tigger is off the board. Goofy's a 3/4, so he doesn't survive that trade either. Pongo doesn't make it. Pascal doesn't make it. Peter Pan doesn't make it. Some of the bigger characters, like Brave Little Tailor Mickey, could potentially survive, but if he hits the field, there's a bigger problem. So I wouldn't just don't hope to see Brave Little Tailor Mickey. You'll be okay. Another cool thing here is Dr. Facilier, Agent Provcateur. He can shift onto your other Facilier, the 3-cost character, and his ability Into the Shadows. Whenever one of your other characters is banished in a challenge, you may return that card to your hand. So Dr. Facilier plus Mickey allows you to consistently loop through your characters, so that way they're a lot harder to get rid of. They're a lot harder to take off the board. Now, they do not reset back to your hand if they're banished outside of a challenge. So if you get hit with a Be Prepared, the Facilier does not trigger. If your opponent uses ping damage from something like their own Grab Your Swords or their own Tinker Bomb, or like the super rare Hans that when he quests he deals damage, or the Plasma Blaster that you can exert to deal damage, so on and so forth. Anything that deals damage outside of a challenge, smash, fire the cannon, so on and so forth. Dr. Facilier cannot protect you. But you can, if you need to, swing your characters in. So, for example, you've got a Dr. Facilier on the board. You can use, we'll go back here, you can use your Tinkerbell Giant Fairy to challenge. Her ability will trigger if she banishes something. If she takes lethal damage, instead of her going into your discard pile, she goes back into your hand, which allows you to set up a reset where you can play her again, and then you get the 1 damage on your opponent's board, and then she can challenge again, and so on and so forth. You can see these loops. This deck is all about consistent loops. You can do damage loops. You can do Broom resets where you keep filling up your deck with cards. You can use your Ursula's Cauldron to filter through so that you can hit the cards you want to see. You can play Whole New World over and over again, and eventually your opponent's going to run out of gas. Like, if you play Whole New World multiple times, there's only so much they can do. You can only have so many copies of a card. And if they don't have recursion with either magic brooms, allowing you to put cards back into your deck, or if they have like Hades or Whole New World in Amber, which allow you to take characters out of your discard pile and put them back into your hand, your opponent's just going to run out of gas. And if you start to see big hitters in your opponent's discard pile, you can at least begin to start doing the math. Okay, maybe you've hit like 2 bells and you're playing against like a Sapphire Ramp deck. Maybe they're running 4. They're probably running 3. So if you can get that third one off the board or get the third one into their discard pile with another copy of Whole New World, then you probably don't have to worry about Bell. If you hit a bunch of items and you're playing against like an Ariel Who's It deck, then boom, a lot of their gas is in the discard pile. If they're trying to ramp out into big things, or if they're trying to control the game and you hit a Whole New World and you see them discard, a couple of Be Prepared, so on and so forth. You have to use the discard pile as a source of information to tell you what your opponent is trying to play and what you're essentially stripping out of their deck, what options they no longer have. And it's a really, really interesting kind of deck. So I definitely want to clarify something. This was not built to be a meta deck. This was not necessarily built to be a competitive list. This was meant to be kind of a fun, goofy, somewhat annoying deck. If it happens to be competitive, so be it. But I just want to make sure people know this is supposed to be something you can play at locals. You can have some fun. You can mess around with people. It's not aggressive at all. Like I said, the only real challenger here is Magic Broom, and you kind of just loop it. So if you don't have a Mickey Mouse on the table, it's not particularly great, but the good news is you can use the brooms to help get the Mickeys back into the deck. You can use your draw abilities to get into the Mickey to get them on the board. There's so much draw power and so much filter. Shouldn't be too difficult to get what you want, but again, you are at the mercy of Be Prepared and giant, massive destruction or AoE damage or board removal. So you do have to be careful. This Mickey is not impenetrable. Like, he goes down to Dragon's Fire. You get hit with, say, like Let It Go, or you have someone play Hades and they put Mickey Mouse into your Inkwell. There's a lot of different things that can make this deck fall apart. That's pretty much every deck ever, but this deck specifically needs Mickey on the board so that you can continue the Broom loops and do what you want to do. So protect these Mickeys at all costs. Do not ink them. You need access to as many as possible. As long as they're not in your Inkwell, you can kind of bring them back using the Brooms. If they go anywhere else, like if they're in your hand, that's fine. But if they get sent to the Inkwell with Let It Go, that's really, really bad, because you have no access to get them back onto the table. Someone was asking, what do you do if, like, so here's an interesting example. You have 1 or 2 magic brooms on the board and your opponent doesn't exert. They don't quest. What do you do? That's a great question. You quest. You start exerting your characters. You start building up your lore, and you force your opponent to do something. You actually have some good questers here. So Dr. Facilier himself can quest for 3. If you have 2 Dr. Faciliers on the board, you can quest with 1 or both, because if they banish one of them, then it goes into your hand. If they banish the second Dr. Facilier, it does not go back into your hand, but 2 cards questing for 6 lore is not that terrible. With Tinkerbell and Grab Your Swords, you should have the opponent's board pretty barren. And so if they don't have any major threats, you can just quest with Tink for 2 lore as well. She's got a lot of gas. If you have the Donald Duck Bodyguard online, you can quest with Mickey Mouse. He does quest for 2 lore, and that's pretty potent as well. And you also have the brooms. If you have 1, 2, 3 brooms, however many you can get on the table, if your opponent won't commit, then you can just quest out, and if they get banished, then they go back to your hand, because let's look at Mickey's ability. Whenever one of your Broom characters is banished in a challenge, which means offensively or defensively, you may return that card to your hand. So you can really get a lot of value out of this. Also, again, if you have Donald Duck with Bodyguard on the board, you can quest safely behind him. Then your opponent has to deal 5 strength into his willpower in order to get him off the board. And at that point, then you have a bunch of other bodies that can do stuff. If your opponent, gets to your Mickey, hopefully you can replay it. You have to be careful here. You don't want to get too aggressive. But again, you could also have your Dr. Facilier on the board. So if they get rid of the Donald, it goes back to your hand. And then if they try and go for the Mickey or the Facilier, again, they got to deal 4 damage or 5 damage. That's a lot on top of the Donald that had basically a 5 damage shield. So they're also, if they're dealing all this damage, they're not questing. There's a lot of interesting plays and counterplays. Another deck that this can have some interesting problems with, believe it or not, is the Reckless deck, where you have a bunch of high strength characters like Gaston. He's a 4/2. You have Maui. You have Taka. A lot of these characters have this really, really high offensive value. Captain Hook, challengers, stuff like that. That can be a pretty rough trade into your protective bodyguards like Donald. He can go down pretty quick. And then you are open to your Mickey Mouse or your Dr. Facilier getting challenged and then just taken off the board. So you do have to be careful not to overextend. You want to use the tools available. So you've got Grab Your Sword. This is a very powerful tool. You can use this to deal a significant amount of damage and then set up a Tinker Bomb play where she swings into something smaller and then she deals additional damage. You also have your brooms. So if your opponent has reckless characters, Gaston's a great example. It's a 4/2. He can beat up things a lot bigger than he is, but you can exert your broom. You can quest with your broom, and the Gaston, because he's reckless, has to attack, and you get a really good trade where their Gaston attacks or challenges the magic broom. They both get banished in the challenge because they deal 2 damage to each other, but the broom goes back to your hand if you have Mickey. The Gaston does not go back to the hand if your opponent isn't running Dr. Facilier. So you can set up some really forcible trades that are good, and then continue again with the Broom loops, feeding your deck with cards, and then emptying your opponent's deck with a whole new world. Now, another question that's come up is, do you hard cast Whole New World or do you sing it? That's a great question. It depends on the board state. It depends on the situation. You only have 3 targets that can sing this song: the Queen, Tinkerbell, Facilier. You probably want to sing it with the Queen, because that way you get 7 new cards versus 1, and you have all of your ink available. Tinkerbell Giant Fairy really wants to be challenging as much as possible so you can get the value out of her ability. So that way she's taking characters off the board, she's dealing damage, she's putting your opponent in a really uncomfortable position, and constantly keeping pressure on the opponent's side of the board. Dr. Facilier is an interesting character. He can sing, and depending on the situation, you probably want to sing, but you also want to protect him because he helps keep your pedal on the gas. So once you've gotten your combo up, you really don't want to continue to draw, because you'll draw yourself out and then you'll deck yourself out before the opponent. You want to make sure you've got more cards in your deck than the opponent. So the thing with Facilier is, if you've got great cards in your hand and great cards on the board, then you stop the draw. You just use the filters to control what you draw when you top deck, and you use the bodies and resources you have available over and over and over again, or you play everything out. Then you can sing with the Queen or Facilier to play New World. You don't really want to use New World if you have a whole hand of cards, if at all possible. But again, the idea is you want to kind of turbo rush this Whole New World as many times as possible. You want to play it over and over and over and over and over, and get your opponent down to a minimal amount of cards, a minimal amount of options. So singing with these characters is probably your best bet, because once you sing, you draw 7 cards, and you want that ink available and ready to play out the cards in your hand to keep pressure on your opponent, so that they don't get this massive advantage where you paid 5 ink, you play the song, you draw cards, but you can't do anything with the cards. You want to be able to use those resources to not only draw, but also play. Keep the pressure on your opponent and just make them really, really wonder what's coming and what do they need to do. So that's the idea behind the deck. Again, not necessarily a meta deck. I believe that this is probably going to need some reps for people to figure out the lines of play. It's not very simple. There are definitely times where you do want to do things and you don't want to do things. There are a lot of lines of play, but the idea is smash a Whole New World as much as possible. Use brooms to put it back into your deck, then play it again. Use your filters like Ursula's Cauldron, as well as Dr. Facilier, to continue to look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put the one you want on top, put the one you don't want on the bottom. And you can increase the consistency really, really high. You've also got filters like Simba. You can draw a card, discard a card. Same thing with Tinkerbell, Tiny Tactician. Exert her, draw a card, discard a card. So you can consistently get to those things that you need. And then you use Mickey plus brooms to just loop your cards back into your deck. So you kind of have this hyper efficient deck where everything you're drawing, everything you're seeing is what you want, and everything you don't want has either been played, it's in your hand, or it's in the discard pile in some capacity. So yeah, try this deck out, have fun, enjoy it, and then let us know, what do you think? Is it any good? Did it work? Did you have fun at locals? I have heard some people say that this deck can be kind of expensive because the Tinkerbell Giant Fairy is fluctuating. It can go up past the 20 mark. Earlier during the week, it was at 13, then it was 16, now it's 22. At the time of you listening, it could be a completely different price. So if you have to replace anything in the deck, the most expensive card is Tinkerbell, the Giant Fairy. Next up is Whole New World. Now these are sitting around $10 a piece. So if you can't pick up 4, trade for 4, or if you're playing at locals, maybe, just proxy. I don't know how each store works, but if you're not playing in a tournament and you're just testing for the fun of it, I would say, if you can pick up singles at your local store, trade, do whatever you can. But if you just can't afford it or you can't get your hands on it for whatever reason, just, put a slip of paper that says Whole New World and then, pick up a copy after the price drops, because once we get to September 1st, there'll be a lot more product available. And then a couple weeks after that, the prices really should tank because there's just going to be a massive amount of cards on the market, and they shouldn't be too terribly expensive. But the Tinkerbell, if you had to exchange her for something else, let's look through your options here. So Tinkerbell is there to put pressure on the opponent and deal some damage. So a good replacement for that. You can do a couple of things here. No, we're not running that. What was I? Oh, yeah. So you can put Smash into the deck. So you would have a spot removal, spot damage. So the idea is you could grab your swords to deal 2 damage to everything on the opponent's board, and then you can use Smash to pick out those big threats that have massive willpower, and that's a good thing. Also, you can use Smash mid to late game to disrupt some characters that have 3 or less willpower. Great targets for that would be like Ariel, Who's It Collector. She can, do a lot of things and keep herself safe. You can pop a couple smashes into like a Moana. There's a lot of different combinations where Smash can be a very powerful tool. And if you don't have the access to pull, trade, or buy the Tinkerbell, you can just use Smash. It's not as effective, I'll be very honest, but in testing, it does allow you to pick off primary threats, big targets. So that is an alternative. Another card you can do in lieu of Tinkerbell, think about Taka. So she has an ability. She's a 5/5, 6 ink, 2 lore. During your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you gain 2 lore. So Taka will gain lore, challenge, remove bodies, and if you have Facilier, if she's challenged and banished, she goes back into your hand. So this legendary, I think, is like $3 to $4 at the time of this recording. So you could subsidize the 4 Tinkerbells for 4 Takas. It does a similar thing. It's a different flavor. So Taka doesn't deal the AoE damage Tinkerbell does, and she doesn't deal additional damage when you banish things, but she does gain lore, and a 5/5 is no joke, especially if you have Grab Your Swords. Between Taka and Grab Your Swords and the Brooms, you have all this additional damage where you can pump up Taka to deal 7 damage to a target. You can use Brooms to challenge, deal 2 damage, then Taka can go in and finish the job. Taka can easily beat up very many characters that have 4 willpower or less. You get a body off of the board, you gain 2 lore, and then if your opponent decides to challenge into Taka on their turn, you deal 5 damage back to them. You don't get the lore because her effect triggers on your turn, but your opponent kind of has to get her off the board, otherwise you're just going to gain lore and take bodies off the board. So she kind of turns into a 2-for-1 pretty quickly. And again, with Facilier, if she goes back into your hand, you can just replay her. And if you have Pocket Watch on the board, your opponent has to be really worried about you getting the Taka back into your hand from the Facilier effect. Then you replay the Taka, you exert the Pocket Watch, and then you give it Rush, and you can immediately challenge into something, take it off the board, and gain 2 lore. So this is a pretty good alternative if you want the body. If you want the straight removal or the straight targeted damage, Smash is your other option. So there are some budget adjustments if, like I said, you can't afford it, you don't want to afford it, or you just don't have the options to trade or find Tinkerbomb in your local scene. Here are some alternatives. But everything else is pretty inexpensive if we go back to the deck. Facilier doesn't cost too terribly much. The queen is not very expensive. Grab your sword, maybe $4. Whole New World is the next most expensive, but it is the crux of the deck. So this is the card you really can't avoid. But like I said, currently it's $10 per copy. It should drop. I do not expect it to really get too much past that point. And then everything else, Mickey Mouse, I think is like $3 or $4. Donald Duck is like 40 cents, like $2. This is literally a promo they're giving away everywhere. So she's 10 cents maybe. Maleficent's not expensive. Friends is not expensive. Facilier, I think, is like $2. Cauldron is less than $1. Mirror, I think, is like $2. Maybe. Brooms are not expensive. Less than $1. Less than $1. So yeah, you can definitely get what you want out of this deck if you build this list. But like I said, Tinkerbell can be slotted out for Taka or Smash. Not a big deal if you're on a budget. Taka works great in testing. You can do so many different things. And it's kind of scary with the Pocket Watch. Again, you put that pressure on the opponent. They have to really think, do I want to go crazy questing and exerting and using abilities when my opponent can just play a massive thing, give it rush, and then punish me for it? So anyways, thanks so much for watching. This is a lot of fun. Those are all the decks I've been working on there, you saw. So we'll see everyone next time. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.